Good evening, everyone. We're just going to get started in a minute. We're just waiting for people to file in from the Zoom waiting room. Good to see you all. Okay, all right, we will get started. Thank you all for joining us for this event tonight with Leila Taylor from the Brooklyn Library to speak about witches, houses, and magical spaces. My name is Matthew Engelke. I'm the director of the Institute for Religion, Culture, and Public Life. This is the second event this semester in our Magic series. We have one more next week, just before Thanksgiving. I hope you can join us for that one as well. But we are very, very excited tonight to welcome Leila Taylor. I'm going to have my colleague, Jeremy Dauber, introduce her in just a minute. I'm just going to say a few points of housekeeping before we get started. I know many of you are going to be familiar with the Zoom webinar format, but just to let you know, we are going to run tonight until 7 o'clock Eastern time. Leila is going to speak to us for maybe half an hour or so, give or take. She has a wonderful slideshow prepared for us. Then she and Jeremy will be in conversation for about 20 to 25 minutes, and then there will be time for questions from you all. Please, at any point, feel free to put your questions in the chat, sorry, not in the chat, in the Q&A. You should see at the bottom of your screen a Q&A function. You don't have to wait until the end. You can put your questions in there at any point that they come to you, and Professor Dauber will be able to read them out to everyone and then post them. Yeah, I am really grateful to Jeremy and also to our co-sponsors for this evening's event, and we will put the list of co-sponsors in the chat for you all. We're really grateful for that support and publicity. I also want to thank the staff at IRCPL, especially Gabby Lee, who is here behind the scenes tonight running the webinar, but all of the staff and the whole team at IRCPL for their help in putting this together. I see there has been a question already just about whether or not this event is being recorded. It is being recorded. Hopefully you received notice of that when you joined the webinar, but it will be available for viewing in a few days once we get it up on our website. So please feel free to send it around to your friends and colleagues. Right, so I'm really grateful that Jeremy Dauber could join us this evening to speak with Leila about her book. Jeremy is the Atran Professor of Yiddish Language, Literature, and Culture here at Columbia in the Department of Germanic Languages. And that may or may not sound like a good fit for a talk on witches, houses, and magical spaces. The list of works that Jeremy has published is extensive. They include Antonio's Devils, Writers of the Jewish Enlightenment and the Birth of Modern Hebrew and Yiddish Literature, and In the Demon's Bedroom, Yiddish Literature and the Early Modern, among many others. But the reason I asked him to come moderate tonight is because he both teaches on and is writing a book now about horror and horror film. So a really wonderful pairing with Leila, who is speaking on new work, but I do want to kind of plug her book. Hopefully you can all see it here. It's called Darkly. I read it this summer. It's an absolutely fantastic memoir and history about her own childhood and upbringing and her immersion in goth culture. listening to Bauhaus and The Cure in Detroit, if I recall, but tying that in a fantastic way to, as the subtitle of the book makes clear, Black History in America's Gothic Soul. So we're really excited to be able to welcome her this evening, and I will now turn it over to Jeremy to give her a fuller introduction, and thanks to everyone for joining us.
Well, Matthew, thank you very much for introducing me. And now it's really, as Matthew's saying, a pleasure to be here at this Institute event. I also want to thank the staff for arranging such a wonderful event. And it really is a distinct pleasure to introduce Leila Taylor. And Matthew's already spoken about her book, but let me just second how wonderful a cultural historian and a deep delver into her own history and America's history she is in this book. There are a lot of kind of works on the Gothic that kind of inflect the Gothic in all sorts of different ways, but this book, I think, is one of the most persuasive and compelling tellings of an American history, both personal and national, that I have read in quite some time. So when Matthew approached me and said, are you interested in sort of hearing about new work? I was overjoyed, and I can't wait to hear this with you on Witches, Houses, and Magical Spaces. Now, Leila Taylor is a writer in many other places than simply this book. Her work has appeared in the Journal of Horror Studies, the New Urban Gothic, the Repeater Book of the Occult, and graphic novels, an upcoming journal called Liquid Blackness. And let me just say one other thing, which is that she is an accomplished and sort of wide speaker. We all in the academic business have given talks in various kind of places, but few of us, unlike Leila, have given talks in places called Morbid Anatomy and the Order of the Good Death. And that is pretty impressive and interesting, I gotta say. So without any further ado, I bring you to the Brooklyn Public Library, where Leila Taylor is creative director. And I am delighted to welcome Leila to address us on Witches, Houses, and Magical Spaces. Leila, take it from here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm quite humbled, actually. So this is a work in progress that's part of a larger project on architecture and horror and houses, and the idea of how horror and the horror genre kind of subverts our understanding and our ideas about the meaning of home, essentially. So I'm going to share my screen now. Okay, that'll be fine. So hopefully everyone sees a big pink page with words on it. Okay, so the home is synonymous with family and domesticity, and the house has long been considered the intrinsic domain of women. So part of this talk is about supernatural spaces in movies and television, but more so, I'm talking about how the idea of the single, childless, older woman living alone or living with other single, childless, older women has been, and kind of still is, considered an aberration, something suspect and fearsome. Hopefully my screen advanced. So this is a quote from the movie House of the Witch. And it's about a group of teenagers who get trapped in this haunted house on Halloween. It's horrible. It's a horrible movie. Like, don't even bother looking it up after this talk. But there is one conversation that stood out for me. So what's up with this house? It's just been abandoned for a really long time, so people make up stories about it. It's just old and creepy. There was this old house in the neighborhood where I grew up. The old lady who lived there had like 100 cats. So everyone called her Old Hag, Witch Lady. Every Halloween, all the kids would egg her house. Same house, different town. I think every town has one. So I want to focus on this little bit here about the old lady and the old house that they called a hag and a witch. So this trope is something that we see sort of over and over again. the one creepy house in the block where some old woman lives alone and kids like dare each other to knock on the door. And this is kind of the setup for Monster House, this animated film, which is actually quite charming. And in this movie, the house itself is sort of the vengeful spirit of a woman. So the house itself is becomes sort of monstrous and is the soul of the woman. In Don't Knock Twice, there's a kind of Bloody Mary inspired urban legend surrounding this decrepit, abandoned old house and a witch that was supposedly to have lived there. So in all of these examples, there's this correlation between the strangeness of the house, its age and decrepitude, and the woman who inhabits it. There's something wrong with the house, so there must be something wrong with the woman inside of it. The house is monstrous, so the person who inhabits and cares for the house must be a monster. But first, I want to take a little step back and kind of clarify what I'm thinking of when I'm talking about witches, sort of quote unquote. So Häxan is a Swedish silent film made in 1922, and sort of an illustrated lecture about the history of witchcraft. So this image of the old crone stirring a pot of something, mysterious, is pretty typical of what we visualize when we think of a witch figure. And then there's sort of our collective cultural understanding of what a witch is like based on fairy tales and sitcoms and horror movies, and Halloween costumes. And then there is what I call real witches, so to speak. I'm not going to quote Pam Grossman here. She's a writer and curator and teaches magical practice and history. So she defines a witch as any person who uses magic, good, bad, or neutral, or a follower of nature-based paganism such as Wicca. But then she adds this more general definition of a witch as a figure of transgressive female power. So during the Salem witch trial, the majority of the accused were women on the fringes of society, like poor single mothers or wealthy independent widows. The 15th or 17th century Europe, of the 80,000 people who were put to death for witchcraft, around 75% were widowed women over the age of 50 who lived alone. Also, even if you were married, you could be accused of witchcraft if you didn't have enough children. But Grossman continues, the witch, perhaps, is the only female archetype who is an independent operator. Virgins, whores, daughters, mothers, wives, each of these is defined by whom she is sleeping with or not, the care that she is giving or that was given her, or some sort of symbiotic debt that she must eventually pay. The witch owes nothing. That is what makes her dangerous, and that is what makes her divine. Witches have power on their own terms. They have agency. So now, of course, more women are choosing not to marry or have children. More women are choosing to live alone. But there really is still a little bit of a stigma attached to the cisgendered straight woman of childbearing age who chooses not to reproduce or to live alone. That fear of the spinster or spinsterhood is still kind of a real thing. Like the term housewife has always felt like a strange term to me. A person's identity and role are connected to having a spouse and not having a job outside of the home. You're a wife in a house, and neither of those words actually represent the individual. So the witch house serves a different purpose beyond domesticity and the nurturing of others. It serves only the witch and her needs and desires. But before I start talking about fictional witches in their houses. I want to start with the movie about a real house in East Hampton and the two women who lived there, who may not have been witches, but were certainly enchanting in their own way. So of course, I'm talking about Grey Gardens, the famous documentary by Albert and David Maisel about mother and daughter, Edith and Edie Beale, cousin to Jackie and Kennedy Onassis, who lived together in a dilapidated, garbage-ridden 28-bedroom mansion co-inhabited by numerous cats and a few raccoons who come and go as they please. But instead of talking about, and this is kind of obviously the before and after of what Grey Gardens used to look like and what it looked like in the 70s. But instead of talking about Grey Gardens, I want to talk about Sandy Passage. So Sandy Passage is the first episode of the mockumentary series Documentary Now. And Fred Armisen and Bill Hader play Big and Little Vivi Van Climpton. And they really do sort of a pitch perfect recreation of this movie. The Maisels become Alfred and Larry Fine. Bill Hader really has little 80s mannerisms just down pat. It's fantastic. Here, Big Vivi is in bed stirring a gin and tonic in a fishbowl, which isn't that strange for making corn from bed, to be honest. So for most of it, it's pretty much this straightforward take on the movie. But throughout the episode, there are these hints of something darker, lurking in the corners there. And then the whole thing takes this turn. So while the two are asleep, the filmmakers catch a glimpse of a photo album with clippings of past love interests and swatches of blood-stained cloth. Excuse me. There are photos of past grocery delivery boys with their eyes scratched out. So the show turns into a pure horror movie. Big Vivi lurches after Larry, her teeth bared. Albert runs through the house, passing a series of horrifying tableaus. There's a wall covered with images of his brother with Mrs. Vivi Fine scrawled on the walls. There's a bathtub full of snakes for some reason. There's a shot of the gardener who's in the backyard digging graves. And then there's the last scene, and the Fine brothers are never seen again. An investigator searched the house but could find no evidence of foul play. So it's a pretty easy transformation from reality to horror. Grey Gardens is a creepy place with the gothic qualities of being simultaneously repulsive and riveting. And there's also this discomfort when faced with aging women and their desire. It takes all the cliches we have about the fear of aging and turns them into an actual horror movie. In Grey Gardens, we look at the house and assume that those who live there must be scary because the house is scary. They must be decrepit and uncared for because the house is decrepit and uncared for. They must be horrifying because who would live in such a horrible atmosphere? So Arthur Gale Sheehy lived near them back then and wrote in this article that her 7-year-old daughter used to call the place the witch house. And then she describes this encounter that she had with her daughter. Her daughter found these rabbits, these bunnies on the side of the road somewhere and wanted to save them. So she had seen cats all over Grey Gardens, right? And she thought, well, whoever lives there must love animals, so maybe they'll take the bunnies. So they go and they see Edie. And her daughter says to her, it must be fun to live in a house where you never have to clean up. And little Edie says, oh, mother thinks it's artistic this way, like a Frank Lloyd Wright house. Don't you love the overgrown Louisiana bayou look? Whatever the Beales were feeling about their conditions, whatever fantasy they were living in, they don't behave in the way we would expect them to. They don't act like we think they should. There's no embarrassment. There's no shame. We expect a miserable person to live in miserable conditions, but the Beals don't comply. I actually almost titled this talk Staunch Houses. So now I want to look at a few examples of fictional witch houses. This is an image from Hellboy. It's an image of a Baba Yaga house who's stomping through the forest in the mist there. So in Slavic folklore, the Baba Yaga, which kind of roughly translates into evil old witch, is a grotesquely deformed old woman whose home is a hut that stands on two giant chicken legs, which is so odd in and of itself. It's fantastic. So similar to the Hansel and Gretel story, she lures people into her hut so she can eat them. The door to the hut faces the forest, and when Baba Yaga comes home, she commands her house to turn around so she may enter. That image, it's all the way on the right. Someone made like a real Baba Yaga house at Burning Man, which doesn't surprise me. In 2015, artist Mark Dion conceived of a witch's cottage. That's those illustrations. And in 2022, this year, it was actually built at a sculpture garden in Germany. You know, it's a small little hut, you know, a little bit lopsided, this curved roof that kind of mimics the classic pointed witch hat. There's something quaint and cozy about it. It's almost childlike. In Robert Eggers' The Witch, the structure is built into the earth, suggesting something ancient, prehistoric even, and from nature. So these are all takes and interpretations of the little cottage in the woods that we've come to associate with witch houses. The polar opposite of this is Dario Argento's Suspiria from 1977. And if you haven't seen Suspiria, do so immediately. Like right after this talk, go watch Suspiria. So it's the story about a young American woman who goes to Germany to attend a prestigious dance academy. Unbeknownst to her, it happens to be run by witches. But first, I want to start with the sequel called Inferno. So this was done in 1980. And these are the first two of this Three Mothers trilogy that he has. The last one is called Mother of Tears. It was done in 2008. And it's all right. Suspiria is far the best of all three of these. But I want to start with Inferno because the film starts with a woman reading from a book called The Three Mothers. And it's the diary of an architect and alchemist named Varelli. And his voiceover says, I, Varelli, an architect living in London, met the three mothers and designed and built for them 3 dwelling places, one in Rome, one in New York, the third in Germany. But I failed to discover until too late that from these places, the three mothers rule the world with sorrow, tears, and darkness. I built their horrible houses, the repositories for all their filthy secrets. Those so-called mothers are actually wicked stepmothers. It's always a stepmother, incapable of creating life. And sort of like note that sort of end point about being incapable of creating life. So they're not actual nurturing real mothers. So she believes that her apartment building in New York is one of these 3 houses. And there are lots of sort of very meaningful shots of this building. And by introducing the film with the words of the architect who built them, Argento was telling us that these buildings, these structures that house these witches are just as important as the women who inhabit them. As sort of probably have you noticed, horror genre generally relies on darkness to evoke a sense of mystery or dread. I spend a lot of time lightening up screenshots so they're visible to people. Suspiria does the complete opposite. So the first shot of the building is here in the rain. It's when Susie first arrives. And the exterior is this bright red building, right? With this gold Art Nouveau detail. You know, it's bold for sure, but it's not totally crazy until we get inside. And that's another matter. The space is so striking with these bold colors and geometric shapes. It's sort of like a psychedelic combined with German expressionism situation. It's surreal and it's jarring. And we are immediately aware that we are in a place out of the ordinary. Red is the most sort of prominent color throughout the place, which could signify danger, perhaps. There's also a lot of blue, which could signify safety. And then there's this clash, that often happens, this clash between the two. And actually, I'm just going to go way up to Inferno again for a minute. So this Inferno is nothing like Suspiria in terms of that kind of graphic design, but there is sort of elements of that clash of the blue and the red in that as well. There's the blue, sorry. So the color and this sort of non-diegetic lighting is surreal. This is emphasizing the idea that we are in an alternate reality, separate from the world outside of the academy. For example, there's this scene where the students' rooms have been infested with like maggots or something. So they gather all the students into this one giant room to sleep while they take care of the maggot problem. So first it starts off with kind of normal natural lighting. And then when they turn the lights off, it shifts to this dramatic red, silhouetting the teachers or the witches behind the screen. There's also some crazy wallpaper situations happening here, which just adds this additional layer of visual chaos, so to speak. I love this room so much. And I think this must be the director and her office, I suppose. There's this mural in the back, if you can see the culture, that kind of looks like it might be either a reference to like a Piranesi drawing or an Escher drawing or something, sort of this nod to impossible or fantastic spaces. So this is intended to be a quote, safe space. It feels kind of neutral. But we still get little hints of red that's through a window there. So these little signals of danger. So when Susie finally discovers the witch's lair, their secret place, then it turns into this kind of golden yellow palette. But again, there's all these other textures as well. There are a few scenes that take place outside of the academy. And they're pretty neutral. There's a lot of beige. It's natural lighting. So it makes that transition back into the witch's space all the more jarring and all the more explicit. So even here, this is at the very beginning when she hasn't gotten there yet and she's just arrived at the airport. It's pretty neutral seeming. But as you can see, she's surrounded by people who are dressed in red. And I love that very patterned situation. There's a little red there. So even here, when she hasn't even arrived yet. And I think there are little hints of danger. So the Dance Academy is the public front to the real purpose of the building, the home and headquarters of a coven. It's a place of matriarchal power with a familiar structure that is not centered on a patriarchal figure or on child rearing. The bold colors and patterns, while gorgeous and strange, are not exactly familiar, homey, or inviting, unlike a little cottage in the woods made out of gingerbread. So we all know the Hansel and Gretel story. The grandmother figure lures abandoned children to her house made out of gingerbread and candy so she can eat them. But in the 2020 film Gretel and Hansel, the title already gives away that shift in focus. So like the original story, the children are kicked out by their impoverished mother to fend for themselves. In this case, Gretel is as a teenager, and she's much older than her younger brother. So with no prospects or food, they wander off into the forest. They accidentally get high off some shrooms until they come across a cottage in the forest, which Hansel notices that it smells of cake. So here, the witch's house is not made of desserts, but it is strange and alluring nonetheless. This black A-frame structure is reminiscent of that pointed witch's hat. The warm orange glow from the inside is this stark contrast to the black of the exterior. So that's automatically sort of inviting. Then there's this kind of odd addition of a children's slide just sort of sitting there, which feels ominous, and it's a little hint of what's to come later. Once inside, they discover a table completely covered end to end with food. The interior of this house is just a series of impossibilities. This table is perpetually and irrationally just bursting with food all the time, hot cooked meats and breads and cakes and fresh fruit that never seems to go bad, despite no obvious source for the food. One night, after finding her brother missing, Gretel discovers a door in a closet opening to an impossibly long stairway. This leads to an immense open space with bare brick walls that's far deeper than seems plausible. The house is an uncanny space, larger on the inside than it is on the outside. Compared to the warm and homey space upstairs, this space feels cold and utilitarian. Going down into that basement space is a transitional experience, a gateway between the space of the home and the magical space where the sausage gets made, literally. After confessing to eating her own children, the witch tells Gretel, "I assumed a disguise of old age to make myself seem kind and weak. I built for us a house, one with a proper kitchen and a dining room." So that warmth, the sustenance, and the comfort of that upstairs space is the lure and the disguise. The cold, sparse, morgue-like space downstairs is the reality. The witch, like the house, is also in a state of duality. In the upstairs, she's old, but in the downstairs space, she's young, which is her true form. In the case of Hansel and Gretel, the house is designed to be alluring and tempting to children to an absurd degree. In Gretel and Hansel, the house doesn't have to be constructed out of candy and gingerbread. It only has to offer safety and maternal comfort. In the Netflix series, Brand New Cherry Flavor, Lisa Nova is a young filmmaker, newly arrived in LA and determined to make and direct her first movie. So she meets Lou Burke, a big-time director who promises to help her and introduce her to all the right people and get her a contract. At a party, she meets Boro, played by Catherine Keener. And this party, she's supposedly going to meet some of these super important people. So Boro warns Lisa, "That man you came in with, he's having a very important conversation without you." Boro, who seems to be predicting Burke's inevitable betrayal of Lisa, offers her services to hurt someone for her. She tells Lisa to imagine that Burke is a house. Imagine he's a house and you're wandering around. Imagine that you're inside him. Now break something. This idea of the house being connected to a person runs through the entire show. So she gives Lisa directions to her house. She says, "There's no number, but you'll know it by the jaguar out front." It's a gorgeous mural of a jaguar, which has meaning later on in the show. So Borrow's house is kind of in a nondescript area in LA, but her house looks like it was just dropped down from another place in time. It's plantation style house with these big columns lit from below through the fog. By day, it just looks sort of abandoned. There's graffiti all over the door. So when Lisa arrives, she doesn't go to the front door. She goes to the back, or makes her way to the back. So in all of these movies, there is this sort of public space and magical space. And there's this transition from the normal house or the decoy house to somewhere else hidden. So when Lisa enters Borrow's home, she enters a veritable jungle. And it's not clear if we are inside the house, outside the house, or both at the same time. The entire space is just covered in lush with plants, and that's pretty much the entirety of the space. It really does look like you're in the jungle. Lisa lives in a kind of shoddy apartment building. She's also the only person in the building. It's not clear if that's Borrow's doing or whatnot. But after the curse against Burke is cast, Borrow gives Lisa this parting gift of a potted plant. But overnight, the plant has grown up the wall and down through the floor into the apartment below. Lisa is connected to Burke, rummaging around through the house of his mind. Borrow is connected to Lisa, so her jungle materializes in Lisa's apartment. So this is what it looked like before, and this is what it looks like afterwards. Also, there's a trap door that appears in her bedroom. And once she finally gets the door open, there's a long, long ladder leading down, down, down into this vast empty space. Not the apartment below, this completely other magical space. So this porous nature of the connection between Borrow and Lisa is both psychological and emotional and physical, and it's manifested through their homes. So I want to end with another real house, this one in San Jose, California. This is the Winchester Mansion, as some of you probably know, also known as the Winchester Mystery House. I'll just pause and let people absorb this for a minute, because it's kind of hard to absorb all at once. Sarah Winchester was not a witch. When her husband died in 1881, he left her with $20 million, which is about $562 million today, plus 50% holding in the Winchester Repeating Arms Company. She was one of the wealthiest women in the world. That's a little drawing of her. So she moves to San Jose and buys an 8-room, 2-story farmhouse and a ranch. So this is the original house. Over the next 20 years, that would expand to 24,000 square feet and 160 rooms. There are stairways that end at ceilings, doors that open to walls or to empty air, big rooms that contain smaller rooms. So the legend goes that Sarah was told by a medium that she needed to keep building the home to pacify the spirits of the dead who were killed by her husband's invention, the Winchester rifle, or else she would die. So she reportedly employed construction teams around the clock, 24 hours a day, every day. Supposedly she never stopped building for 20 years. And she would communicate with ghosts in a special seance room where she would receive instructions on what to build. On the left, there is an example of a staircase that goes nowhere. It just sort of hits a ceiling. On the left is, you can see it in little tiny type there, a door to nowhere. It's a door that just opens up to nothing. Um, so the Winchester house is chaotic, unrestrained, and irrational. So we assume the woman who built it must be chaotic, unrestrained, and irrational. Right? Uh, this is this is supposedly a floor plan from the house, and I will admit I'm not sure how accurate this is or authentic it is. It feels right though. So grain of salt with this particular image. While the legend certainly draws in tourists, the reality is much less interesting. While there was a big interest in seances and spiritualism at that time, there is no evidence that Sarah Winchester was into it. Parts of the house were damaged in the 1906 earthquake, and instead of rebuilding those areas, she would just sort of seal them off, resulting in stairs and passageways that led nowhere, and building did not go on nonstop 24 hours a day. The simple thing is she loved architecture. Excuse me. She did her own drafting. She read architectural manuals. And I think she just made her really enjoyed the process of building. And she had the financial means to experiment. So Winchester House historian Janan Boehm says, I think she was having fun. And I think that she and her workers probably brainstormed and bounced ideas off each other. So maybe on rainy days or during bad weather, if she wanted to keep them working, she'd say, oh, why don't you go over there and build a few rooms, you know? She called it her hobby house, excuse me. She was very private. She never talked to the press, which just sort of added to the legend and the rumors. This is the only known photograph of her. She was described by the press as being obsessive, reclusive, guilt-stricken, and childless. Again, childless. One article from 1911 called her home the Spook Palace. Rather than a mad woman driven to build by vengeful ghosts, to me, the house seems more like a three-dimensional sketchbook of ideas, and it didn't need to make sense to anyone other than herself. Homes are supposed to be inviting and welcoming. Sarah Winchester's house seems to say, I don't care if you come in or not. I don't care if you like it or not. Boehm says she was different, a woman in her time who controlled her own fortune and controlled her own life. She was suspect automatically. So I'll end with a quote from author Carmen Maria Machado from the book In Defense of Witches. So she defines a witch this way. She is a woman, single and childless. She has her own little house, or in Sarah's case, a massive house. She is an artist or a craftswoman or a scientist, if you imagine magic as a kind of science. She is wily, self-satisfied, and in charge of her own affairs. She commands respect. She is, to interesting people, someone worth learning from, if not emulating entirely. She is what happens when women get to direct the warp and weft of their own lives. Thank you.
I can clap on behalf of everybody. So thank you so much. That really was wonderful. So many ideas, so many different directions to think about. So I'm really looking forward to talking about just some of them with you, at least over the course of the next 20 or 25 minutes. And then, I'm going to open it up. I want to remind everybody who is listening that you should please use the Q&A function. You can do it while we're talking. You can do it to put in those. Leela and I can see them, and I'll be moderating those Q&A. So please do that now or over the next time. So, one of the things that I think really came out so powerfully about all of the sort of richness that you've brought to us is how protean a figure the witch is, how many different kinds of things this kind of figure who's really through all of our history can embody. So I thought maybe that one way of maybe having our conversation a little bit is to talk about some of these binaries that are blurred, obviously, but they're binary. And the first one that came up to me, that maybe is between sort of local and other in terms of space, in the sense
Mhm.
that, you start out with this wonderful thing that like every neighborhood has that kind of creepy old house. It has a, and there's a, right. And, and some of those spaces seem to be very much local, and sort of the witch legend kind of comes from that. And some of them seem very much not local at all. You have to go to the woods to find that. You have to, they're sort of out off in the middle of nowhere. So I was wondering, do we feel like witchiness is? I mean, the answer is always both. But how do we balance those two things between it's out there and it's right here? Because I think you have both so powerfully in your examples.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is the idea of the witch as being something supernatural or magical, otherworldly. So it makes sense that they are outside of civilization. They're like in the Blair Witch Project, they're always deep in the woods,
Right. Right.
They're apart from civilization, right? And then there's the idea of the quote unquote witch as not necessarily being magical or supernatural, but simply being scary and being other. And we kind of put our ideas about either being evil or mean or cruel or strange. And we kind of put this label of witch on that. So that local figure, while we may not think of that, woman down the road, we may not really think that she's magical, but there is a strangeness and alienness to this person. She gets labeled as such because she's considered other than civilization, other than people. So there's the kind of fairy tale magical witch that can do magical things. And then there's the woman who's just scary and hates children, who's also a witch.
Right. I'm gonna bring up a book that I think is rarely brought up in discussion about witches, but apropos, which is the Care Bears. I have a 4-year-old daughter, and she loves this Care Bears book where there's a woman down the street, and they call a witch, and the Care Bears show her that it's a woman who's really you should be very nice to, and you shouldn't be mean to the house. And what that brought up to me, apropos of what you're saying, is because there's some of these figures, fairy tale and others, who we seek perhaps to our destruction because they have that power, right? Mm-hmm. And there are others who, when the message of the literature at least seems to be, actually, as you say, they don't really have power, and the fears that they have are a problem with our kind of social treatment of them, our labeling of them. And I wonder, how do we negotiate that in some of the texts? Are they just two very different kinds of texts? Is there a way that one turns into the other? Can they coexist?
I think they can kind of coexist. I think one can kind of turn into the other. I mean, it's interesting. One of the things for myself personally, I always my goal in life is to be that house, that scary house on the corner. Like I've always wanted to be, all the kids think that like I'm scary and weird and a witch. But there's the one kid who dares to sort of knock on the door,
Right.
And then they realize, oh, she's actually pretty cool.
She's awesome, right?
Right.
And that's is it because there's one kind of literature where that's the ending that you want, is the recognition of awesomeness, right? And then there's another kind where it's like, no, that person who's in the candy house is psychotic, and they've got to be, they're going to kill the kids, right? So, it's interesting to see how that, how you decide which genre you're in. And that gets to that really interesting first example that you gave of the Grey Gardens documentary Now parody, where we think we're in a horror show, and then we think we're in a comedy, and then we think we're in a horror show again.
Right.
And so I wanted to ask about that sort of, what kind of emotions do we that's a great example of how two different emotions really, as you showed, came together so nicely. In our discussion of these witches, what kinds of emotions are we supposed to feel? When we come to what does a witch in full look like, so to speak, for us?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's everything. It's very, very complex because there's this and very Gothic, and that there's this combination of something that is scary, and off-putting or alien, but we're drawn to it. There's also something kind of cool about it, or something independent about it. Because there's this other, I kind of stuck with the scary witch genre, but there's
Right.
also, I just American Horror Story Coven just popped in my head. There's also witch, or The Craft, or witches, or Bewitched, for goodness sake, or witches, or like well, that's
Bell
another story,
Booking.
but
Oh, I love Bell
yeah.
Booking. Yeah.
Except she like loses her powers when she falls in love, and that's a whole other
Oh, right. I
thing.
forgot that.
Yeah,
Okay. Fair enough.
that's a whole other thing that I took
Yeah.
out of this talk that was going too long. But yeah, so there's this combination of something that is attractive because it means independence.
Mhm.
It means someone is, living their life the way they want to without social constraints, which is a power and which is appealing, So I think there's sort of the cool witch, there's your Stevie Nicks or whatever. And then there is the fearful aspect of that, because for some people, doing whatever you want and being whoever you want to be is frightening, that kind of putting aside of social norms is a scary thing for a lot of people.
And I think it gets to this kind of a particular kind of comedy, which is which I think all these witches that you're describing, even and maybe particularly the scary ones have, which is irony. They have this kind of knowledge that the people who come to them don't have. And they often use, whether it's Baba Yaga or it's the witches in American Horror Story, or they use it in this kind of way where they're kind of making jokes at the people.
Yeah.
And that can be, among other things, very emasculating to a certain, but I'm also thinking of like the old witch in like the EC comics, the one who cracks all the jokes and things like that. No, I think that makes sense that, what you're saying. So, from that, I wanted to see, if we could talk a little bit about buildings, maybe, because, one of the things that I think you did so powerfully is, you showed how so much of these buildings are, how would I put this, sort of dual in their kind of nature, right? And I wonder whether or not, you in looking at all this, you found that that sort of psychoanalytic approach that you're talking about, how far back does that go? I was just curious to, is that something where, is this very much a product of the psychoanalytic age? Or is it earlier? I think it was a really interesting observation that you're making, about it. So
That's actually a good question. I actually don't know. I think, I'm thinking of things like, the other thing I didn't go into is things like the Wizard of Oz and the big castle space, or things like that.
Yeah.
I think, which is not hidden at all, like in the Wizard of Oz, it's a fortress with a whole military situation happening, right? So I think that's an interesting point, that maybe that looking at subconscious, that this combination of subconscious and consciousness and repressed feelings or emotions that are kind of hidden down below, that's the real, it's the id and ego. Maybe that is. I think it'd be interesting to look at, because I'm not actually sure when that shift happened culturally. I brought this up really briefly, but I was looking at things like I Married a Witch and Bewitched, where I call them domesticated witches, where they're very much out in the open, and it's suburban and it's bright and it's very, very normal. So that house situation where they're living is what everyone else is doing. There's nothing hidden about it. The thing that's hidden is themselves, is their own magical abilities.
Right.
So when they get married and they settle down and move to the suburbs, they have to, repress their witchiness or get rid of their witchiness in some way in order to conform to that space, to that the social aspect of it, but also to conform to the physical aspect.
Right. And those rooms, those houses, I suppose, have kids' rooms, right? Because there's that maternity aspect. And that I think was something very powerful that you brought up, like this anti-maternity of the right, either, and it seems like it's in two very different ways, either because you have presumably postmenopausal older women who are not dealing with that issue, right? Or you have people who are actively hostile to the concept of this. And again, it felt to me, again, working on some of the early modern stuff, the fairy tale stuff, that you have these characters who are related to Lilith and like actively hate children, right? They anti. I mean, I wonder whether or not, but another thing, as you were talking, that came to me was saying, well, you also have, particularly in the 70s and things like that, this sort of sexual free spirit agency, sort of what is anti-maternity in the age of the pill. And I was wondering, I'm so glad you brought up Suspiria. Do you feel like that kind of freedom of sexual autonomy and agency, does that create a different kind of witch?
Yeah, I think so, because what it does is it severs that tie, that connection that equals women equals mother,
right.
House equals home for children, right? It kind of severs that idea and says, no, you can actually exist as an entity completely separate from that. And I'm thinking of like Season of the Witch, which I think was the 70s too, I think 77. And in that, there is a woman who is kind of a frustrated housewife.
Okay.
And she gets meets a witch at a party. It's very kind of like cool swinging 70s thing, and they're, smoking weed and stuff. But so she meets a witch and gets introduced to witchcraft, right? Which empowers her, so she's empowered to get out of this horrible marriage. She kills her husband. That's how she gets out of the marriage. But then she joins a coven, and then she becomes a full witch. So she becomes a full sort of autonomous person when she becomes a witch. But I think the thing with the children, and there's another thing in fairy tales, and I kind of nodded to this, is it's always a stepmother.
Right.
Either in Hansel and Gretel was a stepmother, and all these like Disney movies, it's always an evil stepmother. And I think it's because the idea of an actual mother and the powerful symbol of what mother is for us, whatever that may be, having the mother be the source of evil, be the source of fear, was maybe a little bit too much for people, so they made it the stepmother, not the real mother, but a something in place of a mother, or kind of a representation of mother without being the real one,
I think that makes sense. And it gets back to this sort of question of sexual agency we're talking about. I mean, in the sense that, you watch Game of Thrones, if there's a new stepmother, right, it's always about producing a new heir. But that's not what any of these stepmothers want to do. They are just there for the marriage. They're just there for the erotics of the family.
They're not creating new families.
Right.
They're just there to torment the existing one.
Right. Exactly. They don't care about kids at all, right? I mean,
no.
that's what.
All stepmothers hate children, apparently.
We have a lot of questions, and I want to let people I want to get to them because it's great that people are so interested. I just wanted to ask you about one witch and just get your take on it in the movies. And that is Snow White in Snow White, which I think was, and it was interesting to me because in this very powerful movie you suggested, we have sort of the young woman as kind of the real face, the underground, right? And here we have this sort of almost bizarre sort of transformation into the what we could call the old crone kind of figure. But what's your on that, which I think supercharged the nightmares and the image of the witch for decades, certainly. Any thoughts on Snow White?
Yeah, I will admit something to you. I just recently saw Snow White.
Oh, wow.
I lived in my parents were very anti-Disney. I never saw any Disney movies. I saw none of the princess movies. My dad actually said, that no daughter of his is going to see a movie called Snow White. So I actually didn't grow up with those characters. So it wasn't until recently I was like, I should actually watch this at some point. But I think there's this interesting thing that happens, and this is in the Eggers movie, The Witch, and a lot of things, where there is the witch as a seductive figure, a witch as sort of full sexuality and beauty and all of that.
Mhm.
that either turns into the crone because it's more comfortable,
Uh-huh.
because the
Uh-huh.
crone is supposedly, or the old woman is supposedly devoid of sexuality, so she's less threatening.
That's it.
Um, or the beauty and youth of the young witch is part of the seduction aspect
Mm.
of it. I mean, the interesting thing with Snow White is that, well, they're both kind of portrayed as kind of evil. Even the old crone is kind of not
Yeah.
so nice. And then the pretty witch um
Yeah.
is also kind of not so nice.
Right,
They're just sort
right.
of serving different purposes, but the way in for her, she can't go in as this gorgeous, regal
Right.
creature, that is so much more obviously, sort of so much more either powerful or alluring. So she, like in Gretel and Hansel,
Mhm.
she assumes an old and frail um, disguise
Mhm.
because that seems weak and it
Oh,
seems
interesting.
powerless and it seems safe,
Mhm.
um, because she's just an old woman, right? And people think old women don't have power,
Right.
so they're not afraid of them.
Right. And no, and I think that makes so much sense that, as a result, the movie and the culture is demonizing this kind of figure of the old woman, right? The Disney, apparently, I was just watching it as well recently for this project that I'm doing, took the transformation scene into the old woman from Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. It sort of looks exactly like it.
Oh, wow.
And
Oh,
there's
that's
that,
cool.
yeah, there's that werewolfery that's going on, right? That really, this is what it's like kind of all along. So
Interesting.
it's well, we could clearly be talking about this for a
Oh.
long time, but I want to let other people get in.
Okay.
So the first thing I should say is from Liz, which says, no question, just a comment because chat is disabled. Awesome presentation, which I agree with. But now I'm going to ask the next question, which is from Yasmin, which says, how do you think race plays into the figure of the witch? Would you say that the persona of the witch would be conceptualized in the cultural consciousness in the same way if she were understood stereotypically as non-white women? So
Mhm.
that's Yasmin's question. So now I'm turning it over to you.
Yeah. And that's actually something I was thinking of this entire time because, at least in America, in our culture, in American culture, the witch, as we see it, is white, but there is this otherness of hoodoo, of voodoo, of Santeria, of these other um, practices,
Mhm.
right? That have also been, especially with voodoo, that have also been sort of corrupted and have been sort of perverted into its own weird thing because there's this sort of double otherness,
Right,
you're a woman, but you're also Black or you're Caribbean.
right.
So there's this sort of duality of difference in that respect. And I don't get too far into it or haven't yet, but the way that uh, voodoo or practices like that have been um, used as this fear tactic for Blackness. Um, that's been going on for a really long time, and I think it's only recently that we're starting to see the positiveness of that and the richness of it. There's also I was just thinking of, oh my God, I just lost it.
No. Well,
I just lost it.
well, while you were mentioning earlier in the
Yeah,
talk,
keep
you were
going. Yeah,
mentioning Salem, and obviously,
yeah.
saying all the way going back, that a woman of color is sort of implicated, Tituba,
Tituba,
from
Tituba. Yeah,
the very beginning of
yeah,
our history of witchcraft on these shores, so to speak, or
yeah.
early on, at least in our history of witchcraft.
Yeah,
Um,
because the other thing it does is, because again, the witch, however you want to claim it, is a person of power, right?
right,
So having a person of color, a woman of color in particular, who also has power,
right,
um, is particularly threatening.
right. The one thing all
Um,
these little white girls agree on in Salem is that they've gone to her for the
mhm.
knowledge and for the power. That's
Yeah,
whatever comes after that comes after that.
yeah, yeah.
Wonderful. Okay, so now another interesting question from anonymous attendee, which says, another interesting blurring of binaries is the gender of the witch. While she is always a woman, that's what this attendee says, she's childless and ugly and hairy-chinned. She has some masculine bits to her, so a bit non-binary in the gender sense. How does this queerness work into the discussion? So that's this question.
Oh, yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, because again, I think it's a sort of negation of sexuality. It's a negation of whatever femininity they might have. And that, again, in our culture now, kind of automatically, or has been, I shouldn't say now, but has been sort of equated with something that is either alien or other or unattractive, you know?
Right.
So I think the queerness of the witch is the sexualization of the witch, and making it clearly not only not childbearing, but not attractive, like the power, like there is no there, like as opposed to the alluring witch, you know, that seduces. The old crone witch can't use that power, cannot use that power of seduction that the young alluring, you know, kind of the figure can. So I think it's a way of kind of, again, taking away power by taking away whatever that tool of seduction is. But I think, I mean, the interesting thing about that is this kind of difference between the sexualized witch versus the non-sexualized witch, right?
Mhm.
And if we're only talking, and one thing I kind of didn't make so clear in all of this talk of when I'm talking about women and I'm talking about sort of these issues, I'm talking about cisgendered women, because I think there are family structures, they're queer family structures that don't follow this at all, that have their own systems and their own, you know, hierarchies or whatever. So I am sort of talking about a really sort of traditional cisgendered patriarchal kind of family structure, and queerness takes that away. It takes that idea of there's a man and a woman and a child, and that takes that structure away. And for some people, again, that is an uncomfortable thing to take away that predictable familial structure and break it. That's scary for some people.
Yeah, no, and I mean, I actually don't know what I think about this, so I'm going to throw it to you. But which is, you know, there is a structure in what you've mentioned, you know, that is certainly strongly articulated by one queer filmmaker, or creator, which is not quite the conventional family structure, but which is the coven. And I'd be interested. I'm thinking of primarily Ryan Murphy's Coven, American Horror Story Coven. But also maybe The Craft, although I don't remember the movie that well, I confess. So that might be more. But what is something? Is there something sort of queer, let's call it, about this kind of, where people, you know, about the coven as a structure, or something that's non-heteronormative at least? I don't know what I think about it. I'd love to hear what you.
Yeah, that's what the beauty of the coven is. I mean, especially like something like Suspiria. You know,
right. Okay.
There are hardly any men in Suspiria, and they're very kind of, you know, sort of, they come and go. They're really not part of the story. And that's sort of the beauty of the coven, is that it is a purely sort of matriarchal structure, and there is tension, and there's evil, and there's good, and there's nurturing, and there's, you know, conniving, and all of the complexities that you would have in any kind of relationship with people, only you take the conflict of men away from it, you know? And I think that's why I think there's this movement towards this kind of new coven witchcraft thing. Like I don't have it with me, but oh yeah, I'll just show it this book since I happen to be standing right here. This is Waking the Witch. There's this is the Pam Grossman book.
Oh, okay. Oh, great.
Okay. The woman who is in The Craft, pardon me pasting it because I'm literally looking at my bookshelf because I can't find it. made a tarot deck. But there is this sort of resurgence of the witch and the coven as a space, as a female space
Mhm.
of comfort and security and power. And I think I've heard people will kind of call their own group, their own friend group, who is happens to be all female or female presenting or female identifying. Because again, I'm not talking about necessarily that kind of binary system. You can have a person who doesn't have a vagina, who's a woman. But yeah, so who are calling themselves their coven,
Mhm.
because I think it is it's implied to be a safe space of sort of nurturing and empowering and care,
Mhm.
that happens to be in an all-female identified sort of construction, so I think the coven has moved from being this, Macbeth scary situation
Right.
to being something really empowering, like the craft, where it was all about, we're going to get together, me and my best friends, and we're going to, cast some spells and kick
Yeah.
some ass.
Absolutely. And to the architecture, if I remember correctly, and again, it's been a while since I saw it, that season of Coven, they live in this amazing house that's sort of airy and
Yeah.
clean and beautiful, and was again, it felt very empowering in that kind of way.
Yeah.
So
It's
a lot
fantastic.
a lot of our questions are more almost like a lightning round, which is, let's see what your impression is of these particular
Uh-oh.
cultural texts. So
Okay.
I'm going to throw them out, and you can pass like a game show if you want to, but we'd like to hear what you have to say. So the first one is, I'm going to make it a little bit broader.
Okay.
Any magic, any witches, particularly Melisandre, but in the Game of Thrones, the Song of Ice and Fire, that kind of thing. Again, you can pass if it's not something you want to
I will
pass.
pass because
Okay.
I don't actually watch it. I'm
Okay,
sorry.
fair enough.
Oh, wait, I remembered what I was going to say.
Oh,
I'm
let's
so
do it,
sorry.
Let's do it.
This is going back to the non-white witches.
Yeah, go.
My first witch that I recall, someone actually, Pam Grossman asked me this, is what was my first sort of cultural witch? And it was Lena Horne in The Wiz.
Oh, wow.
It was not the wicked. I remember seeing Wizard of Oz and Glinda. Like, her voice annoyed me, and like her wand just seemed kind of stupid. Like, I had no connection to the Wizard of Oz. But in The Wiz, that was just this magical, gorgeous, fantastic creature that I could identify with. And it was Lena Horne,
Right.
So I think there are touchstones out there for referencing non-white witches that for me was fantastic.
The first movie, by the way, I ever saw in a movie theater was The Wiz.
Really?
Yeah, it was the first movie that I ever saw. Not the last, but the first movie I ever saw.
Mine was Invasion of the Body Snatchers.
Oh my gosh, really?
Yeah.
Well, it set you on a course, right? It's
okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No.
Lightning round.
I think it's great. Okay, so how about, I'm going to go back to our list that our studio audience has given us. Hogwarts, Hermione Granger and Hogwarts is now the question.
Oh yeah, because she's sort of she's a half witch, right?
She is, I'm reading this to my children. She is, there's this weird sort of quasi-racial thing in the book, right? So she is half a
like a half
background and half from a Muggle background.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because she's sort of portrayed as being, I would say, kind of shrill, kind of a know-it-all,
right.
Right. She's the girl in that group. Right. So, and she's the smartest of that group. And because of that, she's sort of portrayed a bit negatively, I would say, because she's the smart one. And somehow that still sticks in our culture as being a negative thing or something, not attractive or not feminine or whatever. And that was my first instinct when I hear of Hermione. I was like, she was a smart one, and everyone kind of thought she was annoying because of it.
Yeah, and I think it gets back to this thing you've been saying about this fear of women possessing knowledge. That the witch, I mean, so many folk healers were then accused of witchcraft or something like that, but they knew
Yeah.
what to do in a way that
Yeah.
many of the male medical professionals were killing people left and right, sort of.
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of that are non-white figures as well.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times the quote unquote witch is the healer, it's the
Right.
person with the medicine. It's the person who,
Right.
so in other
No,
cultures, it's not a bad thing.
that makes sense. Okay. We got two more that I see on the questions. If anyone else has any others, they certainly can. But two other. The next one is, what is your take on Eve's Bayou and its compassionate
Yes.
/ complex view
Oh,
of
yes.
the Black Witch Moselle Battisti?
Mhm.
That is the question.
Oh, I love that movie so much. Yeah, that's another one where the witch figure, the one who is the source of magic, is God, I'm trying to remember. It's been a while since I've seen it, but it's someone that one would go to for advice and for help.
Mhm.
It isn't a person who is fearful. It is a person who has power, right? It's a person who has knowledge that others don't have. There is a specialness and otherness to that, but it's not necessarily fearful, or it's not necessarily scary. I think I'm remembering this right.
I have not seen this since it came out.
It's
So.
been a long time since I've seen it as well. I really need to revisit it. I really need to watch it again.
But
But
I'm
yeah,
gonna-
it's yeah.
No. Please finish.
No, but again, it's the other idea. Again, the idea that the witch, or the person who practices witchcraft or what have you, is not necessarily a negative thing. It's a source of knowledge
Right.
that others do not have. It's a skill set that others do not have.
And
It's
I'm gonna-
access that someone doesn't have.
Yeah, I'm gonna ask you to inflect this maybe in a direction that I know you've worked in previous work, which is the regional aspect of this. How does we've talked about place and sort of a house, but in some ways you can build a house anywhere, but you can't just build any house anywhere. How do we see witchery kind of inflected by sort of the local regional currents in America? Let's say, Bayou is an example. It's right in the title.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's interesting because a lot of horror in this respect, and about witches and things, is a lot of it's in the Northeast, a lot of it's in New England, right? And there are houses, literal houses, that we identify with as being, whether it's old Victorian or something like that, or
Right.
it's something that's very either American or Western or things like that. But I think that there are, I think it depends on where it is you live. And I'd have to think about this a little bit more, actually, in terms of geography. I think wherever it is you live, wherever the space is considered familiar, it's either putting a person of powerful magic in a familiar place, which is a contrast, or putting them in the place that is alien or not familiar. Like if you grew up in the country, if you grew up in the woods, a cottage in the woods is not scary.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
So, right. So, I think in terms of place and structure and architecture and the actual buildings, depends on where you are and what your understanding of that place is. Like Suspiria is in the city. It takes place right in the middle of a city.
Right.
And then I didn't talk about the new Suspiria, but in the new one, it's kind of in this strange neighborhood, and there's like graffiti everywhere, and there's bombed out stuff, It's either something elegant, like thinking of like Witches of Eastwick or something, where it's like,
right, okay,
or American Horror Story Coven, where it's elaborate and it's ornate and it signifies power in terms of money. Or it's the opposite of that, where it's something that represents decay or decrepitness, like the Monster House or the house in, Don't Knock Twice, where the scariness of it is its ruinness.
Right.
you know, the ruined space.
So
Yeah.
I want to then no, that makes a lot of sense, and I want to move to our last question by putting another venue, which is roughly speaking the high school or maybe the college, and this gets to Laura Durante's question, which is we tie maternity and postmenopausal age to witchhood, but what does it mean to have a teenage witch? And she says, namely Sabrina the Teenage Witch, but
Yeah.
channeling my 1990s, I'm going to bring the Buffy the Vampire Slayer, the Buffyverse,
Yes.
in as well.
Those things, yeah.
How is the independence, power, and sexual agency of the witch enhanced or taken away from by their adolescence? How is the power and, in parentheses, newfound sexual agency of a teenager tied to that of the witch? So that's
well, there's a lot of sort of mythology, and there are a lot of stories about the coming of age of menstruating of a girl going from girlhood to womanhood, and becoming into power after that, and that sort of tension between going from quote girlhood to womanhood, so to speak, and that and I'm thinking specifically about menstruation, about when that comes along, and that being sort of a trigger for power, essentially. And there is, for me, also teenagers are scary to me. I'm sorry, in general, teenagers terrify me. But there is this heightened emotional state. There's a heightened psychological state. They're sort of on the cusp of a lot of everything. And I think that tension and that sort of psychological heightening of power, or whatever we think, is a really great tool to use, because it's this time when sort of everything is sort of bursting out, so to speak, you know. And it's also sort of a time when girls are starting to challenge authority. They're challenging their mother, you know. They're becoming rebellious. They're questioning their place in the world, you know. So it's a time period that's sort of ripe for challenge, for challenging authority, you know, for challenging power structures. And it's also a time of sort of beginnings of sexuality, of beginnings of sort of a sexual awakening. So it's awakening. It's a very charged. It's a very charged time, I think.
And as you were saying, if you know, in terms of this metaphor of the house being like a body, and you know, this being sort of an embodied a presence, sort of witchery, it all really comes together in this kind of very powerful way. What you're saying, so the teenage, it makes a lot of sense in that way. And clearly, we could go on and talk for a long time, but I think that you know, this is a natural stopping point. We've gotten to all the case studies from the Q&A. I want to, Matthew is back on, so now I know it's time to go, but I want to really thank you for just an amazing presentation and a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I'm really looking forward to your work on horror stories. Yeah, no, this is great. Like I said, I could talk about this stuff all day, but
and we will.
Zoom has to end at some point.
Yes, no, thank you so much, Leila, for that really, really great talk. And I know we had a broad variety of people attending, but several of my students in a course that I'm teaching now called Magic and Modernity, and a lot of what you said kind of dovetailed in really interesting ways with what we've been reading about and watching. So that's fantastic, and great conversation between the two of you. So thank you so much for joining us, and we're looking forward to seeing what becomes of this project. Is the idea to is this also a book idea, or yeah? So
this would be sort of one chapter or one section in a larger book about horror and houses.
What would be the give us a you know, a tease, like what will be the big arc of the book?
That's a really good question. It's really about what our idea of home is, and how that's expressed in horror movies. Because I started, it's really about haunted. A lot of it is about the haunted house, and the reason why haunted houses are so powerful. The reason why the house in general is such a key component in horror is because of all of the meaning that the house has for us in terms of our identity, in terms of our social status, in terms of our feelings of privacy and autonomy, and privacy, I think I mentioned, but all of that, so much of our identity is in the house. And when horror movies, you get put in a ghost, you got a poltergeist, put in some witches, and all of those things that are supposed to be secure and comfortable for us get sort of ripped to shreds. So I'm kind of looking at, that's what I'm sort of looking at, is how horror movie kind of tears apart our ideas of what is supposed to be safe in a home, in a house.
Well, fantastic. Well, thank you. Thank you so much. We'll look forward to that book, as we did to Darkly. And let me just plug that again here for you. Fantastic book. And this was a wonderful talk. And Jeremy, thank you so much. That was you two can really nerd out about these movies. That's clear, right? Which was great to see. And clearly a lot of the attendees also watch a lot of movies, which is fantastic. But thank you all so much. Our next event is Tuesday the 22nd, so just a few days before Thanksgiving, also on Zoom. And it is, the title is Shamanism, Environmentalism, and Collective Healing. And it's also featuring in the Magic series, but it's crossing over into our climate series. So bringing together magic and the climate, which is probably, we need a bit of magic to help with the climate. But it will be featuring two artists from the Caribbean in conversation with Julian Sanchez Gonzalez, who is a graduate student here at Columbia in the art history department. So please, everyone, join us for that. And again, thank you all so much for joining us this evening, especially Leila and Jeremy. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.